My name is Gribincea Alexandru. I'm project coordinator at Keystone, Moldova, and I will moderate today's webinar. We're very happy to have you with us, wherever you are joining from Moldova, Western Balkans, UK, or beyond. And thank you for taking your time to be here. Today's discussion brings together a topic that is both timely and essential: how we understand and address inequality through data, budgets, and public policy. Whatever we're talking about gender pay gaps, access to service, or budget allocations, the key question remains the same: how we are building a system that works for everyone. We are proud to be part of the Gender Budget Watchdog Network. We are a regional network civil society organization from Western Balkans and Moldova, working to promote gender-responsive budgeting. We monitor public spendings, analyze data, and train local actors, and advocate for budgets and reflect the real needs of women, men, and marginalized groups. We have a great lineup of speakers today who will share experience, data, and practical insights. Before we begin, just a few quick notes. The webinar will be recorded, as you already. Please keep your microphones muted, and when not speaking, feel free to use the chat to ask questions and share resources. If you have a question, please raise your hand with the button. And at the end, we will have time for questions and answers at the end of the webinar. We will begin with our first speaker, who will have about 15 minutes for the input. We encourage you to listen actively and think critically. So the first speaker will be from Albania, Esmeralda, that represents Gender Alliance of Development Center. That is an organization in civil society in Albania working to promote gender equality, social justice, and human rights. The organization plays a key role influencing public policies, monitor gender-based discrimination, promoting gender-responsive budgeting and at national and local levels. Esmeralda, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Alexandru. Thank you for having me today. Hello, everybody. I'm not presenting myself as Alexandru did, but I'm so happy to be here with you all today. And during our discussion or during my presentation, I will be focusing on the gender pay gap in Albania. I will share some latest national statistics, data, highlight the structural factors that continue to hinder women's economy empowerment, and some proposals and some actions that Gender Alliance for Development Center has made related to gender pay gap through the last year and during this year. I'm going to share my presentation. It's keynotes on it, and for sure my colleagues of gender budgeting can share with everybody. As Gender Alliance for Development Center, we are happy to be part of the Gender Budget Watchdog Network from years now. And with me is also Besiana, my colleague of JDC, who's managing the project these last couple of years. And we are trying to advocate for more responsive budgeting even on the local or national level. And just tell me, are the slides moving? Okay, fantastic.
But maybe, Esmeralda, maybe you can do the slideshow so we can see the full screen. Yeah.
Now?
Thanks. Yes, perfect.
So in my time, I will try to tackle a little bit the gender pay gap in Albania. And the idea is to make a brief overview of the gender pay gap in my country, how important it is to identify this gender pay gap, and where are the focus areas, and how it caused, and how the government is working, and how are women being affected by it. Current situation in Albania, main points of it are in the screen. Albania national gender pay gap, like officially, is reported in 2023 by 6.2%, which is lower than the EU average. But, however, This number is misleading because it hides sector-specific inequalities, regional disparities, and invisible labor like unpaid care work. The pay gap is not just a wage issue, it reflects structural barrier tied to occupation, education, geography, social norms, and discrimination. I will try to focus on how this gender pay gap is affecting economic independence related to the woman and what local governments and civil society should do. Going back to the national data, it looks that they are improving. I mean, we have the Instat. It's this institution, official institution in Albania, sending out data. But the idea is that sector specific, it's not separated. I mean, there are no disaggregated data by gender, disability, ethnicity, and location. There are more limits on this. And this makes it harder to track inequality on the proper way. Should companies be more transparent on the salaries? Yes. Mandatory reporting helps detect and address pay gaps. Why I'm mentioning this is that there are a lot of companies, especially those on the garment industry, on the factories that are producing shoes and clothes and importing abroad Albania. They are paying the woman working in there in two ways. I mean, putting on the system for taxes, the minimum wage by law, that is 40,000, like it's less than 400 euro per month. And then when this woman has a little bit higher, they are giving them with the envelopes, I mean hand, paying like by cash, not by bank. And the same thing is happening to the man. And when we have done a study, it looks like the woman and man are having this balance, as on the picture showed on the slide. The impact, it's as mentioned before, pay gaps widens for women with disabilities, rural women, ethnic, single mothers, and these are the group of women in Albania, and I think this is also regional, that are multiply discriminated and have limited access to formal employment. As mentioned before, while the national gap, like the official one, is like 6.2%, on some sectoral industries, this gap is high. For example, manufacturing, as I have mentioned before, especially garment industry, women make up 85% of the workforce, but they earn 24.6% less than men. Also, there are financial services and ICTs. There are large gaps due to underrepresentation of women in senior and technical roles. So what we see is that these gaps are reflecting occupational segregation, where men dominate better paid, technical, and leadership roles. As mentioned, it's very important to highlight that the industries mentioned in finance, due to male domination roles, there are lack of gender diversity policies and unequal promotion. The same thing on manufacturing, for example, where from years now with GADC, we are trying to advocate for the workers' rights, especially as mentioned, there are 85% of the workers on this industry are women. It shows both gender-based undervaluation and right violation. And when we go back to this marginalized woman that I have mentioned before, and you are seeing on the shared screen, there are poor women, rural women, women with disabilities that are at a higher risk of wage inequality. These groups face barriers to education and vocational training, lack of childcare, discrimination in recruitment and promotion, overrepresentation in formal and insecure jobs. And if we go, for example, to the rural woman, they are often work on unpaid family labor, excluded from social insurances that by law should be paid for them. Due to this stigma that it's existed, women with disabilities face a double gap due to both gender and disability stigma, and they are more likely to be underemployed or in low-paying jobs. We were working on an initiative in GADC on employment of very hard people to be employed, and among them there were also people with disability. And trust me, even mentoring them for 6 months and speaking with the public institution and having meeting with businesses, etc., it was very difficult, even that by law every company or public institution that have 25 and up number of people working should employ one person with disability. This is not being respected at all. I mean, very small number of companies are respecting that by law to give an opportunity to people with disability to be employed. And to go a little bit further, we were discussing also with my colleagues at the office during all this time that what are the long-term consequences for these gender pay gap. And lower lifetime earnings, it's equal with reduced pension, limited savings, and higher poverty risk in old age. And we are seeing this every day, because having lower lifetime earnings, yes, it's equal with lower pension. They will have reduced access to credit or property, greater vulnerability to poverty in old age. And so if we are having this woman being paid, I mean, I don't know, less than a man on a specific job, we will see what will happen to this woman after 61, 62 years old when she's ready for the pension, and how much this pension will be for her and how helpful it will be. Because even now, the pensions in Albania are not so good. I'm trying to find the proper word, but the pensions are low for people who have worked 30, 35, or 40 years on public or business. And when comparing to high prices and the level of living in Albania on these last years, these pensions aren't enough. So let's imagine this woman, what will be happen after 10, 20, or 30 years? How will be the gap on the pensions too? Root causes of the pay gap, lack of transparency. I have mentioned a little bit that there are companies who do not make transparent like the proper wage, undervaluing of feminine professions as care. They are called feminine, I put in on quotes, because these are professions that women and men can do. And also weak enforcement of equal pay laws. Jobs in caregiving, education, or garment productions are really underpaid, and the most of these workers are women. Also, we have good laws. I mean, we are trying to be members of EU, and we are working on it, and we are happy to work on it, and we have these laws. We have worked on these laws. The implementations of them is not proper, and it lacks efficiency. I have mentioned a little bit transparency because, as I mentioned, it's very essential for accountability, even for pay gap, but mostly accountability to the taxes and to the states. Social perception, it's, as mentioned, for this feminine profession, still now, I believe and I think that cultural norms still associate leadership STEM and decision-making rules with men and not with women. And even though if we go back and see our ministers in Albania or women members of the parliament, we have increased the number and the percentage of women, but still if we go a little bit further, we don't stay in the parliament, we go outside of it and see these leaderships and STEM as mentioned and decision-making rules, they are mostly occupied by men. Please tell me if I'm going very slow or I'm on time.
You can have 3 minutes.
Okay. I'll put some role of the local governments, being that we are working on the local government, so they have to use gender-sensitive hiring and budgeting, use gender budgeting to plan equitable resource allocation, support childcare infrastructure near workplace, and they also can partner with CSO, civil society organizations working in the country to monitor wage policies in local businesses. What role can the municipality play? For example, is enforce fair employment standards in local hiring, funding support services like training and childcare, and track pay data for workers that are involved in the public. Also, for sure, municipalities have the possibility to apply gender audits or integrate gender into procurement or hiring policies, etc. What role can we as a civil society organization? It's what we do every day: demand, advocate, raise awareness, support victims of discrimination or wage theft, monitor and report on employer practices, as GADC does. For example, we have this toll-free number 0800 1818, where women and girls can report when they have seen some violation of workplace, including here the gender pay gap. And there are several cases that we have helped them offering legal support. It's one thing that I really wanted to share with you, with the group of Gender Budgeting Watchdog Network, is the UPR submission that we at JDC have made last year, highlighting gender pay gap as a key issue. We have included a recommendation for legal reform, monitoring, and a policy charge, and it's very important, and we have highlighted that is the following up. One of the key findings, as I have mentioned, was especially the gender pay gap, and also the report highlighted widespread labor rights violations such as unpaid overtime, lack of social insurance, and gender-based violence. On this Monday, so 2 days ago, our executive director, Mirela Jimandrivi, delivered a statement to the Human Rights Council number 58 in response to the adoption of the UPR for Albania. Because despite Albanians' formal commitment to gender equality, including its engagement in the UPR on the adoption of the recommendations, as mentioned in the government sector, for example, significant gender pay gap workforce is there, is 24.6. So we are highlighting this, and you may find maybe Bessiana or me later, I will share you the link where you can read the statement and we just can go through it. And in conclusion, I will put just 3 bullet points for what to do and what it requires: institutional commitment, private sector engagement, community awareness. So if we all go together, then we will ensure equal pay for equal work. I have prepared on details for each of the slides, so you guys let me know if you have any question during the meeting, or if you want me to send it via emails on detail. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Esmeralda, for your insights. It was very interesting. And as we heard, the gender pay gap in Albania is still a very serious issue, especially for women in rural areas, women with disabilities, ethnic minorities, and single mothers. Women face more barriers, earn less, risk of poverty later on in life. Thank you, Esmeralda. Maybe someone has questions now at this moment for Esmeralda, you can ask.
Sorry, I want to ask you, as a journalist in Moldova, I want to ask you how Albanian media reflected this subject about gender gap pay.
You know, it depends from media, because you know we have media that is going hand by hand with the government, and we have media that tend to be more critic. I have mentioned a little bit that the official pay gap in Albania is around 6%, like the official one, and media almost always it's referred to the official data. But anyhow, there are media who are like highlighting, because with the pressure of these civil society organizations, actors, you know, because we work with media. Media is a partner when you are taking initiatives, or they are implementing a project, or you are advocating for something near the government or the parliament, or for the change of the laws. So yeah, I mean, there are media who are like reflecting the problematics and specifying, especially for the garment industry workers. We are pushing a lot to improve their working conditions and their rights on the job place. So yeah, it depends from the media, Natalia.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ludmila, please.
Hello, everyone. Very important webinar. Yesterday, I participated at the public hearing organized by the Moldovan Parliament on gender pay gap. And this webinar is just in time. My name is Ludmila Ciocan. I'm president of the Moldovan Gender Equality Platform. And my question for Esmeralda is what kind of law enforcement mechanisms do you have in Albania for lowering the gender pay gap? Who is in charge of verifying, providing information check to employers?
Yeah, we by law have, I mean, everything is dependent from Ministry of Finance, and then by law we have this institution that it's called Labor Inspectorate. Labor Inspectorate is by law should inspectorate and control companies if they are in regulation of the law. So because it's mentioned on the Code of Labor that for the same job, if it's done for a woman or man who have the same description, the payment should be the same. So we have this institution. I really don't remember, like, exactly, to be very sincere, if they have the mandate to control, so related to the pay gap. If Esmeralda, for example, is doing the same job that Alexandru is doing, and if Esmeralda is being paid less than Alexandru or not. But this can be checked, because I know that Mirella and Luciana were working last year, I think, or 2 years ago, related to this effective labor inspectorate on the workers' right, and we can check that, and we can share it with Alexandru, and maybe he can share with you later. Yes?
Okay, thank you very much.
Welcome.
Thank you. So the next speaker will be from Moldova. Glossa organization, represented by Natalia Melnic, is as I may say, a modern news organization that specializes in simplifying complex topics like business, economics, finance, social issues, making them understandable for a wide audience. In addition to its informative content, Glossa actively monitors gender pay gap, highlighting gender pay disparities. Natalia, floor is yours.
Eu o să vorbesc în limba română.
In Romanian.
Pentru că my English is very bad. Sorry. Now this one. Toți vedeți prezentarea mea?
Confirm that you are seeing my presentation?
No, not yet.
Not. Okay.
Now, yes.
Now?
Great. Yes.
Okay.
You can make... Можете сделать на весь экран. Если нет, то так оставляем. Нет.
Sorry.
It's okay.
Ok. Bună ziua tuturor!
Good afternoon all.
Sunt onorată să fiu astăzi
I'm pleased that I am part of this webinar
discrepanța salarială de
regarding the gender pay gap in
Eu sunt Natalia Melnic.
I am founder and editor-in-chief of the business edition of Glossa from Moldova with 25 years in experience in the field. Within our organization, we have journalists, editors, and accountants. Together, we are creating context complex that are addressing critical issues from present situation in Moldova. From November last year, we have started a project that is dedicated the gender pay gap.
De fondul european IMS.
It has been founded by the IMS fund.
Ne propunem să analizăm stereotipurile profesionale.
And within this project, we wanted to analyze the stereotypes, how is the economic effect, and to address different pay gaps in different areas.
Cred că toți din voi știți că diferența de remunerare între femei și bărbați este o problemă globală.
It's a global issue.
În Europa, decalajul salarial mediu
este... Europe, the average pay gap is around 13%.
Moldova, această diferență este mai mare.
And the reality in Moldova, it's a bit higher. It's around 15.6% from 2023 statistical data, which is higher than the European average.
Astfel sunt venituri mai mici pe parcursul vieții, mai reduse
less savings and incomes that can affect very much the vulnerable groups and can result in smaller pensions.
Pe 27 februarie a fost ziua egalității salariale.
February,
Centrul pentru Dezvoltare în Moldova a publicat un studiu care arată
Center of Development in Moldova. There have been generated several reports.
39 de zile în plus pentru a câștiga.
We have women that must work 39 extra days versus men, so they can earn.
Dintre bărbați și femei este 29.000 de lei și 29.000 de lei
around
este aproximativ 1500 de euro.
29,000
Și
Moldovan lei, which is more on a yearly basis.
Că evoluția decalajului
And the
crește. În
discrepancies
2013
is higher.
diferența era 11,6%, dar
If you
în
can see in 2030, the gap was around 11%, which increased by 2023 to 15.6%.
Noi am abordat acest subiect.
We have approached this subject
Am realizat
because we
interviuri
have realized that it's necessary to have some certain interviews that are working in this field to tackle this important subject.
Am discutat
We have discussed with the
care
two
activează
men
în profesii considerate pentru
that
femei.
are activating in
Un contabil și un
jobs
frizier.
that are referred to more feminine jobs.
Eu am întrebat pe ambii dacă ei
And
primesc
I have
sau
asked
consideră
them
că primesc salarii mai mari decât femei.
if they are paying and they have more earnings than their colleagues which are female.
Am fost impresionată că
And
ambii
I
ne-au
was
spus
impressed
că nu simțiți o diferență salariată bazată
that
pe
they are
gen,
seeing that they
că
didn't have
lor
a difference
bazează
in
strict
payment.
pe competențe. De asemenea, am intervievat o femeie care
I have
lucrează în șofer de
interviewed
taxi.
one female that
Subliniat că
she is a driver, is a
din
taxi
acest
driver,
domeniu
and we have realized that the women from this
că întrețin o
sector
familie și că banii că nu întrețin o familie și că banii sunt doar pentru mofturile lor.
and they said that this budget that they have and earnings that they have from this job is actually for some additional expenditure on a monthly basis. So it's not their basic salary.
Yes. Mulțumesc. Dar totuși ne-a spus că primește bacșișul mai mare, deoarece clienții consideră că femeile șoferi sunt mai prudente și mai politicioase.
However, they have said to us that the female drivers are more polite and prudent, and this is why they are receiving some extra bonuses due to this fact.
Pe lângă interviuri am creat și videoclipuri.
Also, I have made some video clips
femeilor în
in
Moldova,
terms of women's rights in Moldova,
pentru antreprenoare,
in terms of entrepreneurship,
pentru mamele aflate în concediu,
and also for the women that are in the maternity leave.
Taxe de albastru. Și cel mai mare impact la rețelele noastre sociale, noi avem
and on our social networks,
Instagram, Facebook, și
the
Telegram.
most
Și cel mai mare impact l-au avut două videoclipuri. Unul
effective
despre
impact
unei taxe de rost,
had
despre discrepanțele salariale dintre bărbați și femei.
Had the discrepancies in terms of gender pay, and also the highest impact had female drivers of the pink taxi.
Acestea au generat multe vizualizări, dar și reacții puternice din partea publicului.
They have generated viral sharings and reactions from the public.
Existența acestei probleme.
And the existence of these problems.
Ei au scris că salariile sunt egale pentru cei cu aceeași calificare sau că statisticile nu sunt relevante, deoarece femeile activează în domenii neplătite.
And also they have mentioned that they are not filling the pay gap because the female workers are not applying for jobs for their specific area of working.
Și cu toate acestea, datele statistice spun altceva.
The statistical data says something else.
Conform unui raport
and conform the latest report,
deja, Dacă un bărbat primește
If
100
one
de lei, un
man
5
receives
euro, yes,
500
o femeie
5
primește doar
euro,
82 de lei,
a
aproximativ
female
4
receives
euro.
around 4 euros per hour.
Cu alte cuvinte, pentru că o femeie care
In other words said,
pentru că femeia se câștigă același
in
salariu
order for the
anual,
female
bărbat,
to receive
ca un
the
bărbat,
same
ea
amount
trebuie
as
să
the man,
lucreze cu 2 luni mai mult.
she needs to work double the time of the man.
Și cred că aceste realități trebuie discutate
These
deschis.
realities, we
Iar
need
noi,
to
ca jurnaliști,
tackle them very
avem
openly,
responsabilitate să aducem în fața
and
publicului
we
nu
have the
doar cifrele, ci și
responsibility to
povestile
share
reale
this
cu oamenii
information with the public, not
să
just
continuăm
the
cu
statistics,
aceste
but also the
inegalități.
realities, because these discrepancies still exist.
Și de aceea cred că munca noastră la Glossa
Our
este
job at Glossa
esențial pentru a
is
informa și
essential
sensibiliza
for
publicul.
to inform and also to sensitive the public about the existing issues.
Eu am finisat
I have concluded
discursul meu
my
și
presentation now.
Poftim.
And of course, if you would like to address any questions to me, I'm open now or during the question and answer session. Thank you.
Thank you, Natalia, for your presentation. It was interesting to hear about Moldova, interesting facts. Yeah, the gender pay gap in Moldova is real and it's a growing issue. Now it's 15%, and the perception is very different in the country. We women must work 39 days more than men to earn the same amount. For long term, the problem will grow. The pension is lower and the vulnerability is higher. Thank you. If someone has some question, you can ask Natalia. Okay, thank you, Natalia. And the next activity will be poll questions. It will be something interactive. I will open now, and please answer all the questions, everybody, so we can go on. So the polls will be about equitable remuneration. It will consist of 7 questions. And take your time to answer. At the end, we will share the results. Sorry, do you see the questions? The poll question? Yeah, okay, great. I invite all the participants at the webinar to participate at these poll questions. I see now that 8 are participating at the poll questions. To participate, you have to click on the code scanning button. Two more minutes and I'll prepare the results. Till now we have 20 response. Okay, so we have 21 response. I'll end the poll. Or still somebody is answering. $22. Okay, let's see the results. So the first question is which European country do women on average earn slightly more than men? So the correct answer is Luxembourg. The second question, in which country do childless women typically earn more money than male counterparts? So it's Ireland and Australia. You answered correct. Globally, women earn 20% less than men on average. So it depends on your experience. So most of the answers were yes, personally, yes, witness, but not personally. No, never encountered. So in Moldova, I think it's more like no, never encountered. Which sector do you think gender pay gap is typically larger in your country? Typically, it's private sector, I must say, in Moldova. Maybe in Western Balkans is differently. Who should play the biggest role in closing the gender pay gap? Of course, the government. And would publicly available salary information companies help reduce gender pay gap? Definitely yes. Public available salary. Which sector shows the biggest gender gap in your country? Employment and pay, the biggest one. Most of the responses were. Thank you for participating at these poll questions. We'll continue with our next speaker that is from Macedonia. Macedonia is ready. So it will be Tania Ivanova from the organization Reactor, Research in Action, a civil society organization in North Macedonia focused on evidence-based policy, social research, and advocacy. Tania Ivanova has experience in qualitative and quantitative research, project management, and policy analysis, particularly in areas such as governance, education, gender equality, and marginalized groups. Tania, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'm trying to navigate between thousands of tabs and apologize in advance because I don't have a PowerPoint presentation, but I will try to cover as much as possible. And I will also share my screen despite the fact that I don't have a PowerPoint presentation, just to have something to keep our focus on the screen. What I'm going to say is based mainly on a regional research project that I was involved a couple of years ago, more precisely 2002 and 2012 and 23, where there was a case study of several countries in the Western Balkans and beyond Western Balkans, because Croatia and Slovenia were involved. But I will share the screen and just briefly use the study to keep my focus and to also keep your focus while I'm discussing a lot of facts. So as I mentioned, this is a policy brief that we did with a couple of colleagues from the region. It was a case study for Croatia, North Macedonia, Serbia, and Slovenia, and it aimed at trying to bridge the gap between the payments in our countries. It was done together with a couple of networks, but it was published for FEPS, which is an organization based in Brussels, and they were the lead organization for this study, as well as the publisher for the study. Support by Olaf Palme, of course, and then I will try to focus on several topics and not to repeat what my colleagues from the other countries have said, because although we may be geographically a bit apart when it comes to the Caucasus and Western Balkans, but unfortunately we face the same problems and same barriers. So I will try not to repeat myself, and I will try to focus on, firstly, how is the situation in North Macedonia when it comes to legal and institutional framework for fair pay, and then focus on some of the structural barriers to fair play and a couple of conclusions. First of all, I would just like to discuss the EU legal and institutional framework for fair play in my country. And to mention that apart from our constitutional guarantee, which says that each citizen of Republic of North Macedonia is equal in their rights and freedoms, regardless of their sex, race, color of skin, or national and social origin, including also political and religious beliefs, property, and social status. So all citizens should be equal before the constitution and the law, but in the 21st century, we are still fighting inequalities.
Sorry, can you talk more slower? Because the
sorry for the
can manage
translators.
it.
Okay, I apologize to the translators because I'm a fast talker. So I'll try to be as slow as possible. So apart from the constitutional guarantee, we also have important legislation in place, like for example, the ratified ILO Convention number 156, which we inherited from ex-Yugoslavia. Then we are fully committed to the UN 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, as well as the EU integration process and everything that it requires. The country has a framework of sustainable development policies and guidelines defined by the National Strategy for Sustainable Development, which is valid until 2030. And we also have several different and important strategic documents that also guide the equality principles, including the equal pay. But to cut on the details, because I don't know how much time I have, I would just mention that apart from the Agenda 2030, we also have some legislation in place since 2005, when the law on labor relations included provision for protection against discrimination and equal opportunities for women and men for the first time. And then in 2015, we also amended the same law to require equal pay for women and men and equal treatment in relation to employment, working hours, working conditions, occupational social security schemes, and absence from work, which means that we do have some legislation in place, and yet the legal framework for equal pay is not fully in line with the EU acquis, especially when it comes to transparency of salaries, and it needs further amendments. But it's not only transparency of salaries. For example, there is a directive from 2006, also another one from 2023, which requires pay transparency, and they're not transposed into national laws, especially the recast directive from 2006, which is very important, and it has been quite a while that we haven't managed to fully transpose it in our laws. Additional existing regulations remain a challenge for our institutions. There is a multiple crisis going on, frequent elections, and this also, of course, influences the pace, but also willingness to make the changes is another issue that could be a reason why we are lagging behind. And it's not only us, it's the whole region. So the situation is not so nice when it comes to salary transparency. It is not at all embedded in our legislative framework, and the only exception is the announcement of salaries in job advertisements, which is not also fully followed by all legal entities. And there was a question in your quiz whether transparency of payment would make any changes. I definitely think it will make changes, because at least we will have a clear picture of earnings. Because for the time being, we only depend on the data that the State Statistical Office produces, and this data, as my further information that I will show on the screen will show, are not always timely and structurally collected and published. So what is also noted in the North Macedonia country reports by the European Commission is that the National Gender Equality Index remains as a key indicator for measuring citizens' equality when it comes to our topic of today. And even when it comes to this index, the data that we are using is not always timely and updated. I will just mention one very important study which was done for the last time in 2014, and that is the study on time use, which we use to measure the burden that usually falls on women. One of my colleagues mentioned this earlier. So I believe that such statistics should be timely updated, and we had a couple of advocacy initiatives towards the State Statistical Office to finally implement this study as promised and as planned in their 5-year annual plan. From policy perspective, we need to state also the importance of the legislative changes concerning the statutory minimum wage, particularly for low-paid workers, which has been documented by different analysis and research data. And it has shown some progress when it comes to lowering the gender pay gap, just because women are segregated in low-paid sectors, like for example, leather industry, textile industry, and apparel industries all together, where majority of employees are women. And it's very important that the changes in the increase in the minimal wage was positive for these women, and it was also substantiated by the observed small but still positive shifts when it comes to low-paid female workers, which occurred when the law on minimum wage was amended in 2017. So we can say that there is some small progress. And what I'm saying is also confirming that we need specific programs targeting women to address the cultural and societal under-evaluation of their work, which are very important for narrowing the persistent gender pay gaps in the country, apart from the legislation that I mentioned, and the overall conditions for women in general, while utilizing the unlocking hidden workforce potential of more than half of our population. As I mentioned, I didn't have time to prepare my presentation, but I will go swiftly through the document just to have something on the screen. So I just discussed briefly the national legislative institutional frameworks for fair pay, and I would like to focus on a table which shows a lot about what I'm saying. When the State Statistical Office database was last checked for this study, it was in the summer of 2023. There was no data available, not only for North Macedonia, but also for Serbia, for all the years around and after COVID, which is a really sad case to have, because it was a pandemic that influenced women the most, or more than men. So it's really important to emphasize this, that we need this data, especially in times of crisis, in order to follow what the progress is. And this particular study wanted to see whether there is any impact from the pandemic, but it was impossible to see this impact for Serbia and North Macedonia because there was not enough available data at the time being. A couple of important surveys were concluded in the meantime, but the last time I checked, they were still not published publicly in the public domain. So the structure of earnings, although it was finalized last year, we still don't have access to this data publicly as it should be. But to cut the story short, I would just mention that the last officially calculated gender pay gap for North Macedonia was in 2018, where we have the last data that is available as disaggregated by gender, which means that it was around 16.8%. And another issue that I would like to emphasize, which results from being involved in this study, is that when we are looking at the figures and the percentages, we should be really careful. Why? Because they are not always calculated on the same basis. It's really important to mention this, because if you can look at the sources for this table, you can see the difference, which was very difficult to explain to the person who was leading this study, because calculations are usually made on average monthly gross earnings per person paid by legal entities. While in North Macedonia, we only had average gross earnings per year with all the taxes and social contributions, which were disaggregated by gender, and this was only publicly available also per hour and per year, but not monthly data was available. So it is important to mention this, because if you use the different sources, you get differences in the percentages. So what we like to focus on is the trend, not the specific figures and percentages, because sometimes they can be different. As you can see, I have a number of different calculations which show differences depending on the source that we have used. So I'm not sure how much time do I have, but I said that I will try to focus. This was the overall gender pay gap that I just showed. When it comes to structural barriers to fair play, I would like to focus on a couple of them. And also I would like to mention that another discrepancy when it comes to data and availability of data is that it was difficult to provide data for both the public and the private sector for North Macedonia. The table that I'm showing here, for example, type of ownership and gender pay gap in Serbia and Slovenia, you can see the difference when it comes to a country that is part of the European Union, and it follows the annual calculations as per agreements. That is Slovenia. They have information for all the years that were in focus from 2018 till 2021. And when we wanted to see what happened during the COVID, it was impossible to see that for Serbia and North Macedonia because there was no data at the time. So we could only focus on 2018 back in almost 2 years ago. And this is important to mention because I think it's really important to have the data out in the public domain so that we can check the trends and focus on possible improvements. Someone from my colleagues already mentioned the gender pay gap being influenced by care responsibilities. So I will not focus on this, but it's definitely a finding in this study as well, because it's very important that care responsibilities influence women and their salaries, especially when they have to stay out of the labor market for some time to raise the children or to care for the household or elderly people in the household, which usually often falls on women even in 21st century. So when it comes to yes, as I mentioned, there are differences in the sources that we used for this study. That's why we couldn't have tables and comparisons because, for example, for Serbia, a net monthly wage could be calculated based on the data for gender, while in North Macedonia it could only be done based on gross data for annual earnings. So that's why these tables are not together, because I don't think that data is comparable since it is derived from different sources. But informationally, I will focus on my country. Informationally, we can see how the gender pay gap increases over the years. And then it goes down and at the very end of the life of the working life of females, and that is 60 plus age category. And this, one of the reasons why this is happening is the mentioned direct influence for the for care responsibilities that usually fall on the women. But this study did not go further into analyzing whether this is the only reason why, because it simply didn't have this in the methodology. So this is just an assumption which can be backed by many other research studies and information that care responsibilities definitely influence the gender pay gap figures in our country as well. Another information that is also interesting to see is educational gender pay gap. And I will focus on the numbers for North Macedonia, for example. Here we can see that the educational gender pay gaps are higher for women with primary and secondary education, but also there is a high discrepancy in salaries when it comes to higher education, master's and doctoral studies. So unfortunately, having higher education is not secure way to secure equal pay for women as well. And again, I would say that it is important to emphasize that the source for this calculation is the average gross annual earnings and annual bonuses and allowances by level of education and gender, and data that was available by the State Statistical Office. The last available was in 2018. I'm not saying that there wasn't any data for the follow-up years. The problem was that the indicators were not gender disaggregated. And this was a huge issue that we have discussed with the State Statistical Office several times. They were busy with the census, they were busy with the COVID pandemic and many other unforeseen risks. So as of this year, I think that the situation should be improved. I haven't been able to check the latest available data on their Maxstat database, but I know that they have done several studies which were delayed, and they should be published if they're not anytime soon, so that we can check what is going on in 2024 at least. And I may have taken too much time. I'm not sure. I can't see the screen when I'm presenting, but if the moderator would tell me if I have more time, and then I will try to.
Not much time left.
Not much time left. Thank you. Okay, so I would just like to mention a couple of interesting notes when it comes to. I will stop sharing my screen. I would just like to mention a couple of important notes. For example, when it comes to occupations, it's also interesting to see that there are differences based on occupational groups. And for example, the highest gender pay gap for North Macedonia when it comes to occupational groups is among managers, craft and related trades workers, as well as plant and machine operators and assemblers. There are two occupational fields that mark a negative trend, which is the positive inclination towards female workers. And these are observed in armed forces occupations and skilled agricultural, forestry and fishery workers. Another interesting fact when it comes to the gender pay gap is sections of activities. Again, we couldn't find any gender disaggregated data for the years after 2018. So I would only mention this data, and in order to let you see what I'm seeing and make it easier for you to follow me, I will just share this screen and the table that I try to color so that you can see the different countries. As I mentioned, Serbia and North Macedonia remained within the reference year 2018, and Croatia and Slovenia had all the other data. So for North Macedonia, in construction, we have the lowest negative. No, it's other service and activities where we mark a negative trend, which means it's positive for women. It's the gender pay gap is minus 21.7, and when it comes to construction, it is minus 9. But this could mean because construction workers are mainly male, and women are in administrative positions which are higher paid. So considering the specific construction sector, I think that we should observe this with some reservations. And then the highest gaps when it comes to gender pay gap, the highest gaps come in manufacturing, information and communication, and even highest in human health and social work activities, where we observed a gender pay gap of 44.5%. So in a nutshell, we still have a long way to go, and we still have a long way to go to have available, timely and transparent statistics in order to calculate this based on many meetings that we had with the State Statistical Office over the last couple of years. They don't see these calculations of the gender pay gap as their own task. So at least they promise to produce data that other organizations or institutions can calculate the gender pay gap based on the data that they can produce. And I would stop here and leave space for any questions, comments, or whatsoever.
Thank you, Tania, for your presentation and for highlighting the importance of making data public transparency is important for understanding and addressing gender pay gap. Without accessible data, we can't hold the institution accountable or push for fair, effective policy that ensures equal pay work. Thank you. Does somebody have some question? You can raise your hand or you can speak. If not, we can go with the next speaker. The next speaker, we have two more. It will be from Montenegro, Marina. Do you hear me?
Yes. Can I
Yes.
start?
Marina is Executive Director of Association Youth of Disability in Montenegro, works to improve inclusion, influence policy, amplify the voice of often left unheard, and advocates right of persons with disabilities with a strong focus on women and girls. Marina, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Do you hear me?
Yes.
Great. I will switch in Montenegrin. My presentation is in English, but I'm a bit tired and please understand I will be more effective and efficient if I speak in my language. I hope you can see everything from my presentation. Can you just confirm that?
Yes, we see. You can make full screen. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes.
U redu, sada ću govoriti na crnogorskom jeziku. Prije svega vam hvala na pozivu.
First of all, thank you for the invitation, opportunity to attend this webinar and convey Montenegrin experiences, primarily regarding the women and girls with disabilities who I work with through the organization. And I myself identify myself as a woman with disabilities. As regards this topic that we are talking about today, briefly, I would like to point out that we should view it from multiple aspects, facets, that is to say, the number of fields that affect the treatment of gender responsive budgeting regarding women with disabilities. First of all, we have here the reduction of the poverty rate, which in relation to the general, it's not available for women, especially the women with disability. When I say this, I mean the public measures and policies, that is to say, whether we talk about the executive, practical level, or whether everything that characterizes the responsibility of institutions, system, individuals, and all those who should deal with the reduction of poverty rate. Then we should certainly provide social protection through the entire system, especially including the rights that are guaranteed in instituted in Montenegro. These relate to provision of social services, then education, then employment, social barriers and inequalities for the women with disability, because they are rather prominent as kind of negative effects in relation to men with disability and women without disability. So all research and studies show that women with disability are severely exposed to such inequalities, and in general, all other inequalities that characterize the women with disabilities in comparison with women without disability and men with disability. I already stated here the institutionalization as in inverted commas as a method of protection, and it is related to residential type accommodation. I believe that this or homes for children and institutions that exist in Montenegro, because other data of institutionalization means exclusion from the community life. There are no such things in Montenegro, so there are no data on the number of women and girls with disability, or this case of inequalities. They are excluded from the community life because they live in the family without socialization, which characterizes the life in a community. As regards the general policies in Montenegro regarding women with disabilities, then they do not treat sufficiently the problem of women with disabilities. It is related to the policies related to disability, but also gender equality. These are the bodies of the United Nations, primarily the Committee of Disability Person of 2017, with their recommendations, and Grevio report on Montenegro of last year in the field of violence and its prevention. And I don't know how these reports treat this effect, and also there is a lack of relevant information on transparent funding, for example, affirmative employment with regard to the women with disabilities. This is again something which is in the recommendations in the context of improvement of the pay equality. Unfortunately, in Montenegro, there is no representative research on the costs of living for women with disabilities. In this case, we refer to the United Nations Convention, which imposes upon the member states, including Montenegro, that disability should be treated as a social phenomenon. This is a personal disability or impairment, then various barriers and lack of support. In this context, one should assess what, in this case, the women with disabilities pay additionally due to barriers that they are faced with and the lack of support. And then it could refer to many fields: health care, education, public services, certainly traffic, because traffic is absolutely not accessible in Montenegro, and which requires additional funds. Although this issue, we've been advocating this issue for years now, as regards Montenegro, maybe it would be worthwhile mentioning that the action plan is only now has begun to be prepared for the women with disabilities, which means, and it should have been started in 2017. The two bodies initiated it, so we do not have the single and unique measures as recommended by the committee in their report. SIDO committee sent to the government last year their report, so there is no action plan in this field, and currently we have an initiative for the development of a new law on gender equality and some other strategic documents that could deal with this issue. With regard to women with disabilities in Montenegro, I would say that they are not covered with public policies in terms of guarantees and norms and laws. You have measures in strategic and plan documents. As regards the economic life, in total, what contributes to the inequalities in pay, there are measures in the employment field and strategic documents therein, but there is no single unique additional, I would say, sub-measures which would lead to the implementation of this measure and for example, in the reports of any state agency, including the Employment Bureau, there is no strategic, there is no data on the implementation of the strategic measure and how it contributed to the employment of disabled women, the improvement or increase of earnings and their becoming equal. And what could be interesting, and these are official data again, that the out of the total of unemployed persons with disability, women make up 66.6%. This is data from 2024 of 31 December 31 last year, and their record says that there are 5,234, which is 16% out of the total number of unemployed persons recorded at the Employment Bureau, which means that they make up the biggest individual percentage in comparison with all other categories. And as regards the issue of employment, that is to say the statistics regarding employment of disabled persons, then out of the total number of 4,550 disabled people employed at the end of last year, 2,310 are women, which is less than men with disability. In this respect, I don't have comparative data regarding women without disability because, like I said, no report treats this issue in that manner. Therefore, there should be a more detailed analysis. And currently, we are not in an we do not have the possibility to give more data on this issue. As regards the documents that can be used or that were developed in the last period and can still be current is the research carried out by my organization, the Association of Disabled Youth. We analyzed how is the gender responsive budgets taking place in the projects that are implemented by the government, that are opened by the ministries at the annual level, and we research the fields of discrimination of people with disabilities as a special field, then access to justice and protection of women against violence. This is a document that I could share. What is characteristic of all these documents is the fact that state agencies, they have their own individual records. In such cases, the competent ministries of education, social care, and labor, we are in their report, but there are no single unified data, and they are not desegregated as regards the women with disabilities. So, for example, with regard to accommodation in the institutions of social and children protection, as well as residential accommodation, only at individual request you can receive data on the number of girls and women accommodated and other categories. So not only the disabled persons, as is the case with the elderly people, homes, etc. As regards, let me explain this, because in the case of great institutions and rate as in Montenegro, in general, when with regard to women and girls with disability, which leads to poverty, and in such situations, there is no protection at all. We are currently implementing a study regarding the inclusion of women and girls with disabilities into the political life of Montenegro. So we will be very glad when we complete the project. We will compare the rate of people with disabilities and without disabilities and their inclusion in the political life of Montenegro, and we will methodologically do this based on standards through a questionnaire which is of in-depth character, and I believe that we are going to have solid data. Also, we had a study on gender responsive budgeting in social protection of children. It was published in 2024, meaning last year, and it concludes that regardless that there are strategic measures regarding employment of disabled persons, that in practice it is not implemented through additional significant measures, specifically allocated funds for employment of women with disabilities. So based on the data of the statistical office on employment of disabled women in comparison with those without disabilities, there are no data on the gender gap or equality of pay between men and women or disabled normal persons, and in which sectors are work the women with disabilities. Certainly, we will deal with this issue in the coming period, and we expect that we are going to have more specific data based on the law on freedom to access of information. Before sharing data on the report, I want to go revert to what the current situation in Montenegro, which is completely opposite to what should contribute to equal pay and equal earnings. Namely, the Ministry of Labor and Social Dialogue published the amendments to the professional rehabilitation of disabled persons in February this year, and the law stipulates the decrease of the rights of the employers. I'm pointing this out because I heard from the colleagues from other countries, they mentioned this field, and in general, this is a policy measure based on consultations on employment. So Montenegro has a special law which deals with the field of employment of disabled persons. However, even the effective law doesn't provide any specific measures for disabled women. And like I said, with the rest of figures that I shared regarding the unemployment rate among the women with disabilities, their intention is to diminish the rights, the existing rights, which is a regression, and we requested that this law be withdrawn from the enactment procedure because it requires detailed analysis before it undergoes that procedure, and we were indicated that in the draft there is no new norm regarding women with disability, considering their severe inequality regarding employment and pay, and the ministry doesn't deal with this issue at all, and there is no progress made or any improvement with regard to the current law. So last week, for the first time, a protest was organized of representative organizations of people with disabilities, which was supported by BROM and other organizations who are active in many fields, but also by many individuals. So not only disabled people, we had broader social support, and it was the first protest of its kind, which means that in Montenegro in general, we started this movement for people with disability, and we showed opposition to some intentions of the government due to many deficiencies, but we had certainly had objections, but we never had something like this. And the Ministry of Finance in the beginning reduced the budget for people with disabilities by 11 million euros, and we indicated that this will be very negative consequences, and we fear more that women with disabilities who are employed will face more negative consequences in terms of their losing their jobs, reduced earnings, and let alone other rights. Also, we expressed our fear that women who are the majority at the record of the Employment Bureau, this is something which is in procedure. We will see what the consequences will be of our request. But this is a moment when we have this so-called shortening or diminishing of the earnings of disabled persons because they are the beneficiaries of this right. And at the end, very interesting quality report published by the Center for Democracy and Human Rights related to the monitoring of the implementation of recommendations on a Syrio committee. Baraikos was hired as an expert, and yesterday it was published and shared. In this respect, we have all these reports that were shared partly active. We lack single record or general analysis of the position of women with disability, which is very important. If I have a couple of more minutes, a short comment generally related to women in the context of women with disabilities. Do I have time? May I?
Not much time left.
If
short?
Yes. Very short. Okay.
Yes, I'll be short. International Organization, Labor Organization had a study related to Montenegro with data on women in general and the gender pay gap in Montenegro. So these data are very characteristic in terms of individual sectors, including public sector, etc. This is something the government adopted as a document through the national program for dignified work, but again, we do not have individual data on disabled persons because it is impossible from the point of view of the ILO to do this in view of the fact that the government doesn't have such data that can be used to create a single database. I believe that I will have time, some other time to make recommendations and present more data. And for now, I'd like to thank you for the time allotted to me. Thank you.
Thank you, Marina, for your presentation. I can say that it's already a challenge to collect data on women and men in general, but it becomes even more difficult when it comes to persons with disabilities, especially when disaggregated by sex, such as men and women with disabilities and men with disabilities. Thank you. Does someone has some questions to Marina? If not, I can ask one question, quick question. Do women with disability face a double pay gap compared to men without disabilities? What is your opinion?
Certainly. At the very beginning, I already mentioned that the social barriers that are characteristic in general regarding the people with special needs are especially valid for women with disabilities. All the research data, what is our practice, show that women with disabilities are less educated, for example, in comparison with women without disability and women in general, and especially the men with disabilities, because they will acquire lower level of education, and the data shows that many more boys with disability are involved in the educational process than girls. I don't know the reason, because it's unusual that in Montenegro there is double number of boys with disability who have completed education in comparison with the girls. And like the data I shared, the employed women with disabilities are higher in number than the men. I don't know what the reason is for this. We keep asking the institutions, but without answers. And in this respect, in the education and employment process, the women of the women with disability are much less on leader positions as compared with the men with disability, and in general women are less on leader positions. Then women are with disability are more exposed to violence than women without disabilities, and research shows that they are 3 times higher at risk of violence. And unfortunately in Montenegro the violence is not processed and is not recognized regarding women with violence, I would say, because of the deeply rooted prejudices and stigmas and biases. So unfortunately, multiple times we are unequal, and the questions related to women with disability are not very often in the public unless they are initiated with such women. So there is no general support regarding the issues of women with disability. Very rare people will talk about the maternity of women with disabilities, and women with disabilities that started with as women never receive any support from the community and the system regarding the care for the children, so they do not have employment. For example, to have some shortened work time, then have work time, which would help to striking a balance between their roles as mothers. That would be in brief. And certainly, if there is interest, I would speak longer about this issue. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marina. Okay, so we'll go with the last speaker. For the dessert, I left the UK, Liz Hind. She represents Women's Budget Group. She is a PhD in History and Philosophy of Mathematics. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And it's always a bit bittersweet to join colleagues from Europe as well. One day we'll be back, don't worry. But it is for once sunshine in the UK, which if you've ever been here, know how rare that is. But it's also our budget day. So yeah, apologies that this presentation will be sort of quite short on some detail, but we've been doing this around preparing for our spring statement in the UK today. So to talk about gender pay gaps in the UK, I've actually added a couple of comments as colleagues were talking about the lack of data on gender pay gaps in their country and how that they think that this lack of transparency is a problem. In the UK, we have an abundance of data on gender pay gaps. So we have 2 main sources of data for gender pay gap. So our first, this is a screenshot of the zip drive that you can download from the ONS that will tell you information about the gender pay gap in the UK. So as you can see, it's, we don't just get one report on gender pay gaps through our Office for National Statistics. We can subdivide it by different types of geography, by age groups, by occupation, by work to travel areas, all sorts of different ways in which we can report on gender pay gaps. And all of this, you can download it, you can put it onto graphs. This is all freely available and regularly updated. The data for these reports comes from our annual survey of hours and earnings. There are groups of women that are excluded from this, particularly self-employed women, but it gives us a good picture of what the gender pay gap is across the UK. The only thing that's really missing from this, going back to what the previous speaker was talking about, is it's still difficult to get intersectional data on gender pay gaps. So whether that's intersectional by disabilities or different ethnic origins, national identities, LGBT status, all of these different intersectionalities, it's difficult to get that information from the ONS data. We also have gender pay gap reporting in the UK. So again, this is a completely free service. You can log into it and have a look at it yourself. So any company that's employing more than 250 people in the UK has to produce an annual pay gap report, which will show not just the pay gap, but also gaps with bonus payments as well. So a comprehensive report produced by each company, which you can download. You can look at companies by sector, all sorts of information you can download and delve into. The reason I'm bringing this up is because do not think that just because I can see what the gender pay gap is, that there is any sort of work being done on actually looking at the reasons behind this, and we still have persistent pay gaps in the UK. So I am sad to disappoint anyone that thinks that just because we're measuring something means that we are actually doing something about it. We just get to sit around in the women's budget group and look at some pretty charts that we've downloaded from multiple data sources showing us that we still have a persistent pay gap in the UK. So one of the things that we look at in particular, I mean, this graph here I produced yesterday from the data from the Office of National Statistics. So we can look at pay gaps by full-time and part-time. We also produce data on the median gender pay gap and the mean gender pay gap. And you can see here that what we see is that gender pay gap rises throughout a woman's working career. So we can see, if we're looking at full-time occupations, that we start off with a slightly negative gender pay gap at the 18 to 21 age group, and it rises consistently over a woman's lifetime. If you look at part-time gender pay gaps, then you can actually see that the median gender pay gap dips into a negative gender pay gap. So we are seeing, if you look at the median, that there are, women are earning more than men in those groups, mostly because we think men are being denied opportunities to request flexible working and part-time working in professional occupations. So if you have a woman who is working in a professional occupation and she wants to go part-time, she is more likely to be allowed to do that than her male counterpart. So we see there that we get a negative median gender pay gap, although of course we see the mean keeps on rising and the mean is steadily greater than the median gender pay gap. Why? Because we're seeing that women are not rising and not being offered those promotions, so they are far less likely to be at the top end and the top decile of earners, whether they're part-time or full-time. We can see the difference between the mean and the median gender pay gap. If you hear headline statistics from the UK talking about gender pay gap, we always report on the median, because that's how statisticians tend to like to talk about income, because we know that income is not a symmetrical distribution. However, there are plenty of women's organisations, particularly the Fawcett Society in the UK, that will constantly talk about the mean gender pay gap because of that difference, because we know that women are less likely to be in the very top decile of earners, and that's a gender difference that is better summed up by the mean gender pay gap. I could produce an entire spreadsheet of our breakdown. These figures are the ones from the ONS through the annual survey of hours and earnings, where they have calculated gender pay gaps. This is down, data that is available down to quite a granular level. So I've just taken the top 5 and the bottom 5 to show you what gender pay gaps are. Unsurprisingly, we are seeing in the UK the same occupations showing gender pay gaps as other countries have talked about. So, and it is in those traditionally male occupations where we are seeing the highest gender pay gaps, and the traditionally women's jobs where we are seeing the lower gender pay gaps. However, I will go back to my words of caution, because just because I can see these numbers, and just because we have a government who has clearly stated that they want to close gender pay gaps, and we have company level reporting, and companies are asked to produce plans on how they are going to close their gender pay gap, it does not mean to say that we are going to manage to do that within my lifetime. Because the problems that we have, and the multiple problems that we have that contribute to a gender pay gap, are deep-seated issues within the economy, which are not directly measured by the gender pay gap. I produced a map of gender pay gap information from the ONS data. So on the left, you've got the gender pay gap shown by where people are working, and on the right, you've got gender pay gaps in the UK by where people are living. Deep orange areas, they are showing large gender pay gaps in favour of men. The small purple bits you can see are areas in the UK where we are actually seeing a negative gender pay gap. So in Wales, if you're Welsh geography, I'll forgive you for not knowing which bit of Wales that is, that's Aberystwyth. We're not quite sure why, but you can see there that there is a large gender pay gap in favour of women. There's a couple of areas in Scotland where that happens as well. By and large, there is no pattern. Again, I will forgive you for not understanding your regional UK geography, as you don't live in the UK. There is no pattern to this. Where we would expect to see differences because of areas of deprivation or different industries, any of that, there is no correlation between this at all, which of course means that this is a poor way of understanding inequalities that women face, and a poor way of going to the authorities in these local areas and asking them to do something that raises the status of women, that provides an economy in which women can thrive. And throughout all of our work in the UK Women's Budget Group, that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to talk about how do we fix these economies so that women can thrive, that women's contributions to the economy through their unpaid work, we can recognise that, we can support that, we can enable women to have healthy lives and have lives where they are able to thrive, they are able to do what they want to do. So I am here to challenge you and say that the gender pay gap is not the measure that we want to talk about, because there are too many things in that one statistic. And thanks to my introduction, my background is in philosophy of maths and statistics. One statistic will not cover all of the issues that we need to be able to talk about in order to get that economy that actually works for women. So what doesn't the gender pay gap include? Well, for a start, we've got to have that argument about, are we going to talk about medians and means? And if we just talk about medians, we are hiding the problems that we've got in distribution, that we could be looking at a median gender pay gap of 0, and we've still got more men in that top decile, and that we've still got problems with that distribution. So, that's an issue just with statistics alone. I don't know whether or not your countries have a strict definition of gender pay gap. In the UK, it is defined through the Office of National Statistics as the difference between hourly pay, not including overtime or incentives. So, those overtime hours, the enhanced pay, the double time pay, women are less likely to get those hours. Women are less likely to get bonuses. So those are two gender differences within just pay that we are not measuring through the gender pay gap that get ignored. And it just looks at hourly pay. So we are not considering whether or not women are working part-time. We know from other studies, from census data, for example, that women are more likely to be working fewer hours because they've got to get in the care responsibilities. They're more likely to be traveling for caring responsibilities before they get to work. All of these sorts of issues are not covered by the gender pay gap. They're not measured. So as a statistic, when we're asking for what we want, it's a poor statistic to be using to address public policy and ask for the sorts of public policies that we know at the Women's Budget Group that we need to get that thriving economy. And we also don't include any women that are outside of that formal employee economy. So there are lots of women who are working self-employed in one way or another, and they're just not included in gender pay gap information. When we've done that research at the Women's Budget Group to look at differences in pay within self-employment, you're looking at a 40% gap, which is much bigger than our employee difference. So, there's lots of things that we can't talk about, we can't lobby for as the Women's Budget Group and ask for changes in public policy by using the gender pay gap statistics. So it's one that we tend not to use. We tend to try and draw in other data sources to talk about things that we want to talk about. For example, carers allowance. If you have been following UK politics, you'll know that they've just announced a whole set of cuts to personal independence payments, and stop the qualification of that. Well, if you cut that, if you stop people being able to access those benefits, then the carers allowance, there will be fewer women that will qualify for that carers allowance, even though their caring responsibilities won't go away again. So that's a huge issue for us at the moment in the UK, and talking about that, we can't talk about that by using gender pay gap statistics. The other thing that happens, and I can't remember which presentation it was, but somebody was talking about sort of objections that people have when you present them with pay gap data, and they'll say, oh, no, it doesn't exist, the pay gap doesn't exist, because it gets confused with equal pay. We do have the right for equal pay for employees, not self-employed. Self-employed have no route to try and get equal pay. But if you are an employee, there are a lot of very good routes to tribunals and a lot of work done on that. So we have equal pay for employees, but that's still in the UK, that idea of equal pay for equal work still gets confused with gender pay gap information, because again, it's confusing and it's not a very good statistic for us to be talking about when we're trying to campaign and influence public policy for women in the UK. The other problem that I think we're seeing in the UK is that we've got declining gender pay gaps in some areas, not because women are doing better, but because men are doing worse. So, by talking about gender pay gap, we're actually talking about a race to the bottom. That what we really want to be talking about are things like housing affordability. There is no region in the UK where a woman on a median salary by herself can afford to rent a two-bedroom property. Now, that's the sort of statistic that we want to talk about, because that kicks into people's idea of, well, that's not right. Of course, a woman, with a lone mother with a kid should be able to afford to rent on a single salary. So that sort of capability argument that shows this and stops that gender divide and that competition between genders, we are finding is a much better way of talking about the problems that we want. And one of the questions that I was sent to talk about was to talk about influencing local government. This is a big piece of work that I will be working on this year. I do a lot of work with grassroots organisations in the UK, providing free training and support for them. And we've stepped up our work on local government in the UK because we've got a government now that's committed to devolve powers to local authorities. So the white paper was published in December last year. And the sorts of things that are listed in that white paper as priorities for devolution. Here's the list. So we have transport, skills and employment support, housing, economic development, environment and climate change, health and well-being, and public safety. Now, if you ask me to write a list of 7 issues which are very highly gendered, which are fundamental to getting gender equality in the UK, that's my list of 7 things, probably in about that order. Although, of course, violence on women and girls comes under public safety, I would put that up. But of course, what do we need to see in order to get gender equality in the UK? We need transport systems that actually work for women that are trip chaining. We need to stop relying on apprenticeships so that we stop that gender segregation in employment that a lot of colleagues have already talked about, that we are supporting women into those higher paying jobs. We are allowing women to return to work after a break in care. We need investment in affordable housing so you can live near your work and afford to do that. And we need to be looking at women's health because we are still seeing differential outcomes for women's health and men's health, which of course is going to affect your ability to work. And that's where we need to stop talking about gender pay gaps, and we need to start actually looking at other sources of data and making sure that all of our sources of data are not just sex disaggregated, but are sensitive to the issues that women are facing. I mean, this is an example that I was using just this week I was invited to the government cabinet office to talk to civil servants about what we can do for women's equality in the UK. And I pointed out to them, here is the results of a travel survey from the UK, and it doesn't include care-related journeys. Those care-related and accompanied journeys are included in the pink line, which is now our third biggest category of travel, and it all comes under other. So we are not seeing gender budgeting within transport. We are not seeing planning of transports around the needs of women, because we can't even see the needs of women within our transport data, so we can't plan for the needs of women. So my final takeaway thought is there are too many issues that are ignored in gender pay gap data. Lifetime earnings for a start, because that huge income gap over a lifetime you see when women retire and they've got differences in pensions. We're not seeing intersectional data. We're not understanding, the experience of disabled women. We're not understanding the experiences of women that have been made redundant later in life and then are not getting the employment support they need. All of these gender sensitive issues are not captured within gender pay gap data. So even though we have it in the UK and we have an abundance of it, we are still not seeing the public policies that we need to create an economy that works for women. And I will stop sharing there. Thank you.
Thank you, Liz, for sharing UK experience. It was interesting. So we are at the end of the webinar. Does someone have some questions? Yes, please.
If I may, inspired by what Liz has just mentioned, definitely the gender pay gap doesn't include all the gender sensitivities that actually result in what we are seeing in the statistics. And I fully agree that we need to work on this and include these in our initiatives for improvements, because only by measuring the gap we cannot do much. I just forgot to mention that when it comes to intersectionalities, it's very difficult to talk about any gaps or any figures because they're simply not measured. Even our census did not include information on disability, for example, and we did it after 20 years. So I believe that advocacy towards institutions that are responsible for data collection is very important. And when it comes to transport, I will just mention a few figures that we repeat all the time, that 85% of all the cars in North Macedonia are owned by men. So this speaks a lot about transport and roads and public transport and why this is important. And these statistics are available. They're out there in the public domain. And I think that we should all use them when we are advocating for changes. And I am really happy to hear that UK is working on this, but I'm not happy to hear that you're struggling with the same problems as we are. But it's the whole world that is facing the patriarchy that has been there for ages. So yeah, thanks for the interesting facts.
Yeah, thank you for that. I mean, we've had the public sector equality duty in the UK since 2011, which means that public institutions have to have due regard for equalities. Doesn't mean to say that they have to do anything about it, though, is the problem. So we see, from today's spring statement, they've produced an impact assessment that shows that women are more likely to be affected by benefits cuts, and they've published it, and doesn't mean that anyone has to do anything about it. And due regard doesn't even include producing any sort of analysis of it. It just means that you've had a meeting and you've thought about it for a bit, not that you've asked somebody that might know what they're talking about. But I mean, part of my job is to try and get women's organisations more comfortable talking about some of these things and numbers and the economics. because we talk about gender pay gap a lot of the time in the UK. Trade unions particularly are very vocal about this because, well, they would be, because they're trying to get pay rises for their members. And we end up with a spring statement this afternoon where we've got a chancellor standing up talking about how she's going to do this for working people, because that's what we've pushed them into, that's what we've pushed the political dialogue into. And in the meantime, we're seeing huge cuts of support for carers, which is an anti-woman policy, which we know will then have a detrimental impact on our gender pay gap, because women just won't be able to go to work because they will still have to do all of that care work. They just won't be seen doing it. They won't be paid for doing it. And we've still got a chancellor who's claiming that she's a feminist chancellor. And you think we need to get better. And we need to start talking about these issues, I think, and saying, well, gender pay gap is fine, but what about the women that can't work through, disabilities or caring or all of these things? And that won't be covered by any sort of pay or income reporting.
Thank you. Does somebody has one more question? If not, I think we are on time to end the webinar. I express my sincere appreciation to all the speakers for the valuable insights, to each of you for active engagement, meaningful presence, and thank you for the translators. You've done a great job. The recording of today's session, along with the relevant resources, will be shared with you in a few days. And we're also looking forward to continue this important dialogue and strengthening our connection beyond today's event. Until we meet again, stay engaged and remain inspired. Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.
Bye.